Women issues at the University of Toronto. Professor Wane's research interests include gender, colonialism and development, black feminism, indigenous knowledge practices, African immigrant women in Canada, and anti-racism education. And she has published a number of book chapters, books, and articles on these various subjects. Daniel Yan is Associate Professor at York University. He is jointly appointed at both the Faculty of Education and the Department of Anthropology, and was formerly Director of the Graduate Program in Social Anthropology. His research and teaching interests include social ethnography, or rather school ethnography, anthropology of race and racism, diasporas and cosmopolitanisms, anthropology and film. He is author of Elusive Culture, an ethnography of youth, schooling, and identity in global times. And his two documentary films, 100 Men and Setima's Windsong, come out of a larger ongoing project on the making of the South Atlantic world. I pass it over to them.
You know, after the last panel, it's interesting to be standing here because thinking of Cabral, and in particular thinking of his last, of one of his ideologies, Return to the Source, it would have been interesting to have him here present, to listen, to know that it has been very difficult to rupture the white ideology that regulates and controls us with the remote control. And I don't want to go to the debate of what pursued during the last panel, because I think those are questions that are both challenging and at the same time energizes the base, because it just shows that there is need for us to go on the conversation. So my concluding remarks in terms of what has been happening today, I am reflecting on Cabral's work in terms of two main points that speak to his legacy. One is a return to the source, and then the second one is how do we achieve cultural unity when we are so divided, when we are so diverse, when even our own ideologies are so different. I would like to state from the outset that my concluding remarks are informed by readings of Cabral, as well as my interest to understand my own history, my researching the African past, to make sense of the colonial education that I was put through, to make sense of the colonial education that followed me when I left Kenya 25 years ago, and to make sense of what it means to live and to struggle as a black body within the Western Hemisphere. When I think of some of the debates that we have talked today, I would like to evoke the notion of what Asante Mulevi has said, that it's important for us to have a vision. Because when we don't have a particular vision that will guide us in whatever we are doing, what it means is that we'll always be eclectic. We'll always have debates that will never lead us to anywhere. And I'll just quote one of what he says in one of his writings. It is necessary to suspend for a while linearity and to consider the entire world, even the universe, or universes, as one large system where everything is connected and interconnected. And to always remember that Africa is a multiplex of cultures. Everywhere in Africa there seems to be, from the earliest times, a commonality in ways humans have approached the universe, the environment, society, and defined. As we are thinking about what Cabral has done, I think it's important for us to go back to see what are those commonalities. Because it is the commonalities, when we try to bring our debates together, it's the commonalities that will allow our understanding of the African cultures, politics, economics, etc., from the standpoint of an African worldview. And what I mean by an African worldview, it's an African worldview that is built upon the diverse life experiences, rather than any rigid, prescriptive course that as an African or as a black person, this is the way we should follow. We should always keep that in mind. It is as a result that there is no authoritative school of thought for defining the children of African ancestry. As I try to contemplate what a unified voice of African people entails, in terms of how return to the source as a community. I'm confronted with a vision of a huge mountain, and this mountain, we have been talking about it today, and I'll be quoting Kayet. Kayet is what? He says that you, as you imagine climbing the metaphoric mountain, this mountain within your heart and your soul, reflect on the place that you have come from, on the people who have taught you, who have shared with you their sense of place and their understanding of life. As we climb to the mountain and reflect on our past, we begin to understand that life and education are journeys. And many times in these journeys, there are meeting points. And when there are meeting points, what happens? It's a time for dialogue. It's a time to try and understand the divergences and the convergences that cross and illuminate our lives. And then coming back to the notion of commitment, looking at, having that vision and reflecting, it's also important to remember that when our lives, our dialogues, when we have those meeting points, it will be an invitation to share the vision that we have. It might not be a common vision, but it will be a vision that is put together by our collective responsibility, our collective vision of what it means to have a unified Africa made of many, many, many histories, cultures, politics, and philosophies. In his 1996 speech, I'm an African, by South African Deputy President Njoki at that time, laid claim to the greatness of Africa, its complexities, its pain, its marvels. With insight, honesty, and love, Njoki laid claim to his heritage and affirmed the fundamental truth that I'm born of Africa, of African people who are heroes and heroines. That affirmation has been taken up by different scholars. And what it means is that by analyzing his vision, we are again led to believe that all that we have been made to believe about the bleakness of the African continent, the bleakness of the people of African ancestry, whether it's here or whether it's another place, there is something good that they have within them. Because especially when you look at when you look at the famine, like now the various crises in Sudan, the various crises in the northern part of Africa, the various crises, it's very important, it is very easy to point the finger to the African people and lose sight of the colonial legacy, the white supremacist, the white ideology that regulates the way we think and the way we do our politics. And also we have to remember, whether you occupy the lowest ranks in an African society or in this society as an African person, all of us have been subjected to a Western mindset, an education that literally programs how we think within the idea of return to the source. Cabral actually advocates that in order for us to start the decolonizing project, we have to go back to the source. We have to understand, and that's why my work has been informed to understanding the governance of the African civilization, the economics of the African civilizations, the governments of the African civilizations, the feminism of the African women as they occupy particular spaces within the African civilizations. And also, I'm also pulled by Cabral's work when he talked about theory informs practice, and practice informs policy, and that whenever we think of a particular situation, and I really like when he talked about going to the masses and understanding what is their base, what is their energy. I think it's the same ideology we should address, we should be thinking about it today. In other words, I'm saying we should borrow a leaf from Cabral's life in what we can turn this bleak reality that has been painted about African people of African ancestry, the continent, or the people wherever they are living, into a theory, and back to policy formulations that changes how people think of African people, change the current lived realities of many people of African ancestry, so that, for instance, when we think of the gated community in different parts of Africa that they call it have a right, we should not be cheated by that notion that they have a right. We have to look at the current realities of many people of African ancestry in our prisons today. We have to think of many people who are having challenges today. And then we have to think of how do we turn that bleak reality into a theory that can help us to energize the base and start thinking of how to change that reality. How do we ensure, and he talks about this, Cabral talks about this, the notion of understanding our common enemy. I remember in one of his works, he says that we should not think that the common enemy at that particular time during the fight for independence was the white people within Guinea. It was not. He said our common enemy was not simply the poverty, disease, and lack of education, but it was colonization and the parent imperialism. And this is what is following us today. We have to understand what is our common enemy. And when we understand what is our common enemy, then we can start rupturing that, understanding that, and we can try to apply some of Cabral's ideas. Do I help? Should I stop now? Or should I continue?
It's up to you.
I'm energized. I'm energized. And then in terms of going back to to Cabral's work and going back to the source, we have also to look at the notion of language. Because yes, we are here today, we have a common language, the colonial language. But we have also to think of what is it that we have lost in the process. What is it that we have lost in the process? And how, for instance, the work of Cabral that I've been reading, yes, I've been reading it through a translation of one colonial language to another colonial language. What is lost in translation? I think that's one of the work as what that is one of our assignments as scholars that we should do, to find what is lost in translation as we tell our stories. Because many times our stories constitute of a single story. And that single story, we have to start knowing that we cannot have a single story as people of African ancestry. We also have to revisit, when we talk of return to the source, we also have to revisit how African history is taught. We need to start engaging the content of what is taught about the people of African ancestry, wherever they are. Because I believe we are the intellectuals of the world, but that is not the picture that has been painted. And finally, when we understand our histories, when we understand the nuances that are lost in translation, then we can start thinking about the cultural revolution, a cultural revolution that Karenga talks about, that is informed by our understanding of where we come from and where we want to go, that is framed around the idea of a vision and a commitment, because we can have a vision, and many times we do have a vision, but you need to have a commitment. And then I'll come back to looking at, very briefly, some of the ideas of Pan-Africanism. We find that there has been many debates in terms of Pan-Africanism, in terms of talking about the Black movement, talking about the notion of Gavism and so on and so forth. What are the commonalities in all those movements? And what have been some of the challenges in all those movements? And what can we learn from the mistakes and the weaknesses of all those movements? So that as we move to the future, as we put into practice return to the source, that will not be repeating the same challenges or barriers that have not enabled us to achieve that political Pan-Africanism, that political nationalism that we talk about. And I'll just conclude with one quote by Bogewathiongo, who talks of laying a vision of political Pan-Africanism. He says that the political Pan-Africanism should make the continent a base that can be debated, where African peoples, meaning continentals and people of African ancestry from the diaspora, can feel truly at home. So we need to revisit that and say, why is it that when people from the diaspora, when they go to the continent, they feel unwelcome? Some of them feel welcome, but some of them feel unwelcome. Why is it that we always point out that they are not Africans? Why is it that we always, because of this white ideology, we refer to them as white people? Such an African would be a secure base where all people of African ancestry can feel inspired to visit. And remember, when we talk about a space, a particular space, the African continent, and where people can visit, remember that when we talk of the African and the African continent, it's not just a landmass. The African continent lives in us. It's very important to remember that. And I'm echoing Jacques Diop, who talked about when we think of creating that Pan-African movement, it's not a movement that will take us all back to the continent, because we carry the continent wherever we are. It's very important to do that, and Gogo Thiong echoes that. And in Gogo Thiong goes on to say that when we think of that notion of the broadly defined Pan-Africanness, then we have to think of the African Renaissance. And what will it entail? And how would it look like? And what will be some of the guiding principles as we think of the African Renaissance? And is this something that we have to continuously debate and re-debate and re-debate? Are we going to have the same conversation of African Renaissance 40 years after today? So based on this, it's very important that we take an individualized responsibility to think of the unified African voice, to think of a commitment to a vision of African unity, to think of a commitment to an African Renaissance. And at the same time, we cannot lose sight of the collective responsibility, because we have a proverb in my language that one finger cannot kill lies. So you cannot say, I'm going to do it on my own. We have to ask ourselves, how do we do it, and how do we do it best in terms of what are the talents that we bring to the table. So in summary of all this, what I would say that it's a collective responsibility when we are thinking about some of the return to the source, and how to build the cultural unity that Cabral talked about. But that cultural unity should be as diverse and as collective and eclectic as possible. And it should not be informed by what is wrong and right. It should be informed by what speaks to the collective as well as to the individual. Thank you.
I don't have a paper. My job is to try and tie things together and facilitate a conversation. But first of all, I want to, in this capacity as the last person to speak, at least from this position, I wanted to say a very big thank you. This has been a really incredible workshop. So I want to begin by thanking Alex, Chris, and Centine, the graduate students, and of course Pablo. Is Pablo just, no, Pablo's still there, for making possible this incredible time that we've had throughout the course of the day. So thank you all really very much. Second, on the question of nostalgia, I know there's an awful lot in the air. My role in this has been a bit of an evolution, and Chris and I have been, Alex and I have been joking about this because my responsibility has changed 3 times. And when, in the second phase of the evolution, I thought I may have been speaking about actually doing a little bit of presentation on nationalism and Cabral. I actually was reminded of a moment in Harare, where of course I spent a good many years teaching for a lot of the time at a high school in Chitangwiza, which, if any of you know the country or the city, was popularly referred to as Harare, Soweto. And I had a very, very dear, close friend, a guy called Peter Murray. And outside of, in the suburbs, so there's a distinction between the suburbs and what became known as the high-density the high-density suburbs. So there were suburbs and high-density suburbs. High-density became the term that was attached, that the former townships were now called. They were no longer locations, they were no longer townships, they were now high-density. So we worked in the high-density suburbs, but lived, in fact, in low density. And in a lower density suburb called Borrowdale, there was a really lovely little cafe and a bookstore. And I recalled, of course, this is now more than 25 years ago, but when I was invited to do this, I thought about Pete, my really good friend Pete, who is a formidable trade unionist and activist in Britain right now, working largely with journalists. But I remember Pete picking up a book, and I wasn't absolutely sure of the title, but I knew it was Amilcar Cabral's speeches, or one of his sets of speeches. And I also remember at the time that there was it was a second-hand bookstore, and there was an inscription, or I thought there was an inscription in the front. So I actually wrote to Peter a few days ago. He was first of all amazed that I remembered that he'd bought the book, doubly amazed that I remembered that there was an inscription in it. And he said, yes, you're right, I think it was an inscription by Basil Davidson. And I wrote back and said, I don't think it was Basil Davidson. Actually, check for me, check again. So Peter hunted down the book and found it. And he said, you're absolutely right, it wasn't Basil Davidson. But then he concluded that he picked up another second-hand book that apparently had Thabo Mbaki's name in it, and so he conflated the two, Mbaki. But anyway, the person whose name was in the book, who had obviously left at the bookstore, was a guy by the name of Roger Riddell. And Roger Riddell, at the time that we were in Zimbabwe, worked for the development economist, and he worked for a development agency in Zimbabwe, and is now with a think tank in Oxford. So I actually went to the library and was absolutely delighted to find that there were 2 copies, in fact, of Return to the Source. So it's a lovely coincidence that we both have returned to the source this afternoon. Never mind. Okay, and I just want to read you one paragraph, and I do want to make this short, or I'm going to try and make this short because you want to talk and you don't really want to give this to me. This comes from page 51, from the chapter on national liberation and culture. He writes, a thorough analysis of cultural reality does not permit the claim that there exist continental or racial cultures. This is because, as with history, the development of a culture proceeds in an uneven fashion, whether at the level of a continent or a race, which he places in quotation marks, or even a society. The coordinates of culture, like those of any other developing phenomenon, vary in space and time, whether they be material, physical, or human, brackets, biological and social. The fact of recognizing the existence of common and particular features in the cultures of African people, independent of the color of their skin, does not necessarily imply that one and only one culture exists on the continent. In the same way that from an economic and political viewpoint, we can recognize the existence of several Africas. So also there are several African cultures. Now he does hold on to a normative notion of culture, which I think we've seen repeated time and time this afternoon. But I wanted to hold on to the notion of multiplicity that is obviously evident in the last part of that paragraph. Many Africas and many cultures. Now, the significance, of course, is many Africas, because we can actually easily, if we hold on to a normative notion of culture as an entity, then we can conceive quite easily of many cultures. But the challenge, of course, that I think he wants us to take up is to think about the possibilities of many Africans as well. So as I listened to the speech, the presentations in the course of the morning, the first part of the morning, Pablo, Deirdre, Mustafa, and David, I'm assuming it's all right to use first names. I was very struck by how Cabral, in a sense, foreshadowed many of the debates that in the 80s were taken up were being taken up in anthropology around ideas of the crisis of representation, and how we can read back into this work some of the arguments that were being taken up in this particular period, how in fact much of it was foreshadowed in some of what he was writing about. So Pablo reminded us of the vital ethnographic detailed work that informed Cabral's thinking. He did make a few swipes at graduate students. I wasn't sure which ones he was swiping at, because our graduate students...
This was being reflective about my own past.
All right, okay, well I won't talk about our graduate students then. Deirdre talked about made reference to the potential subversive, or this is my reading of what Deirdre was saying, the potential subversive qualities in the creolité that you can actually identify in Cabral's work, and that, of course, incredibly detailed and dense paper that Mustafa gave us. He gave us the concept of the complex meta-racial praxis that emerges out of Cabral's work. And I love this idea of meta-racial praxis, because that kind of rubs up against and is also in conversation with what transpired subsequently in the second part of the session this morning. And finally for the first session, there was a very lovely way in which David talked about the way in which Rodney was able to bring a critique of Africa, and making reference specifically, for example, to the role of Africans themselves in the slave trade. And he used the word the penetrating analysis, or at least I wrote down penetrating analysis, that Cabral was able to lend, or Cabral's work was able to lend itself to Walter Rodney's work. So I was struck in the first session by delighted, of course, given my own disciplinary training and background, delighted by the complex ways in which people were taking up the notion of culture in Cabral's work, beginning, as I said, with Pablo's attention to the vital ethnographic work that was being done. And then in the session following lunch, I guess it was, because the first session occupied, yes. Okay, so Seth then, I mean, this idea of the politics of friendship was just such a kind of, interesting way to talk about Badu, and to get at these issues of Pan-Africanism. But there was a moment he referred to, there are lots of moments, I think he's probably left by now. Oh, I'm sorry, hi. But there was a lovely moment when you talked about Carmichael's visit to Tanzania and Badu, and the sense in which he kind of lambasted these African leaders and also white people. So what we saw here was a sort of clash between, a notion of, back to the business school reference earlier. The business school might say, well, Carmichael didn't know their culture, as in this thing, this bounded thing. And if he knew their culture, then he would have acted differently. But I'm actually thinking, not in a sense of would he know their culture, but I'm thinking about the way in which Carmichael may have been working with quite a different theory of culture relative to the theory of culture that emerges, I think, in Cabral's work. And this is a theory of culture that flattens out differences, whereas from the brief extract that I read to you, Cabral is not interested in ironing out those differences. And Helena's work on racial hierarchies and Ethiopianism. Again, I thought there was a relationship. Sorry, I'm not. All right, I'll continue this train of thought. There was a relationship here between the sort of normative notion of culture that this is not meant as a critique, or criticism. Critiques can be critical or positive. There was a sort of notion of Carmichael's idea of culture that gave her this quest for somehow a sort of the truth about Ethiopianism. And I think what again is useful, and the notion of these geographical imaginaries, Prester John, which arguably we could say was one of the factors that made the push in this direction, and it ultimately led to the opening up of the New World, the search for Prester John. But there might be a way in which we can, clearly it was evident in the contribution to the conversation. In the same way as Cabral talks about many cultures, many Africans, that there in fact are many Ethiopianisms, and they travel differently. They don't, or they can't be translated readily. There are always these threads. There's parts of the source, if you like, if I can use it literally, but there are sort of they take on new lives in different contexts. And I would say something about the two, your point about the two, the mother and the son from East Africa who had to confront the police and declare that they weren't white. They weren't black. And we can talk about that later on. And then Aaron's, I think, rather kind of, for me, thoughtful way in which goes back to, perhaps not consciously, but we might be able to think about the way in which there is a critique of the petty bourgeoisie in Cabral's work, and Aaron didn't sort of put that up as a frame at the beginning, but certainly did, in an interesting way, kind of came back to Cabral at the end as a way of then reflecting upon what he said. And that brings me to, if that's what I've said so far as the first point, so that brings me to the second point, which is to say that the work of Cabral then, in the sense of which Aaron begins to take it up at the very end of his work, becomes not this lens through which the social phenomena or whatever it is that's being described is seen through, but becomes a body of scholarship that is in conversation with something else. And I think now that brings me to my final point about this last session this afternoon. And I do want to return to the question of ontology and subjectivity and multiplicity, which is what I began with. And John, I do want to say that at the time that my good friend Pete Murray was finding this book, that he and I were also reading your work in Harare. And I do want to say that, there's been this incredible consistency in what you've been doing. And there was a sentence right at the very end of your presentation where you talked about the movement. How do you generate people towards a movement? So there's been a consistency there from, whether it's the high density suburb or the middle density suburb or the low density suburb. I've seen that consistency. But on the question of ontology and subjectivity, on the one hand, so we put these ontological questions and questions of subjectivity on the one hand, and we put these sociological categories on the other. And to return to the point I made, about Cabral being this body that we can work with, but never not set it up as a kind of formula to read through. And to return to the notion of multiplicities, one of the things that strikes me about the critique, and I'm talking about my ethnographic observations now on the ground in South Africa, And it's not that I'm doing this research, but you know, I'm sort of ethnographically alert, if you like. And the critique of the black bourgeoisie is absolutely, John, as you describe it. There is a sense in which it is class that matters and not race. There is a sense. So nothing that the intervention of Pablo and Franco would, if you like, undermine or dispute that particular analysis. But one of the things that I am struck by is a great deal of this critique, or criticism. Now, a critique would be, I think, actually putting it too mildly. And I'm talking now about folks that I talk with and talk to, who are in that category of colored, people who are white, fewer who are black, because they're talking a different kind of language. But I'm always struck by a feeling I get when I hear this criticism of, you know, the thing is, they ought to know better. They have been through all of this, and what I get a sense of is that, you know, the problem is, sure, you've betrayed us, you've taken up a position with our former oppressors, and we're doubly angry because you are black. And I think that's the kind of ontological subjectivity question that cannot be contained, cannot be addressed through these more stable sociological categories of race or class. Because there's something that's going on in that resentment. And the resentment is not simply because you betrayed us. It's something about, you know what, it is because you're black. And it's the envy I detect, the sort of envy and the anger. And it's not just, you know, you've become a capitalist, you are a black capitalist. And I think that's resonating with what Ronaldo might be referring to, or at least that's how I see it resonating on the ground, where I see it resonating ethnographically, is the sense, of course there are these sociological categories that work against the neat division of race and class, because it's now so muddled. But there is also a consistent way, I think, and here's someone who, never mind. There is a consistent way in which race continually returns, is forever present. It is because you are black. That's the problem. You've taken all this wealth. You're one of them, and you're black. And I don't really think that interest, that concern with the question of subjectivity and ontology detracts from, because they're two different arguments. But to return to the question of multiplicity, the challenge, I think, is how do we think about these dynamics, all these multiple dynamics together in a way that we can continue to do this work and do this thinking. So that's me in terms of my brief summary of the tying together and the question that I leave at the end. I think it's now my role to facilitate the rest of the conversation.
Yeah, sure.
Or would you like to?